Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for today's program, which is generously supported by the Walters Art Museum's Friends of Asian Art Group. My name is Dani Chan, and I am the Associate Curator of Asian Art at the Walters. Before we get started, I would like to make the following statement. The Walters Art Museum acknowledges the Piscataway and Susquehannock nations that originally inhabited the land on which this museum is located. We also acknowledge tribal nations, most notably the Lumbee, that migrated here, and indigenous peoples whose ancestors are represented in the objects we steward in our collection. To learn more about our land acknowledgement, please visit the link posted in the comments section. Also, please note that this program is being recorded and will be available on the museum's YouTube channel and Facebook page. So today's talk is titled The African American Experience in Chinese Depictions of Global Socialism, and it will be presented by Dr. Sonia Kelly. Sonia is an associate professor in the Department of Art History, Theory, and Criticism at the Maryland Institute College of Art. She teaches classes on the history of Asian art with a particular focus on China and Japan. Her research primarily explores the visual culture of China in the modern contemporary periods, considering the interaction of art and politics in the conceptualization of the nation and its citizens. Her current book project examines the work of government-supported printmakers in Sichuan province in the People's Republic of China from 1949 to 1966. Sonia is also interested in cross-cultural influences in Chinese visual culture and the treatment of gender, race, and ethnicity in Chinese art. Now, if you have questions during this talk, please leave them in the comments and we'll address them during the Q&A. So please join me in welcoming Sonia to our program. Welcome, Sonia.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Sonia Kelly. I'd like to thank, first of all, the Walters Art Museum and the Friends of Asian Art for inviting me to speak. I'd also like to thank Dani Chan and Chandy Kelly for organizing everything and helping me get here online to speak with you. And then, of course, thank you to everybody who's joined us to listen to my talk. And can the slides come up now? Okay, thank you. Okay, so my presentation today relates to research that's still in progress, and I still have many questions about the material that I'm looking at. It's an exciting topic, though, and it's expanding my view of the Chinese art world during the Cold War. I'm examining images of multiracial international revolution that were produced in the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, primarily in the 1960s and 70s. This research is tied to the post-World War II international socialist movement, or movements, such as the non-aligned movement, Pan-Africanism, and the push for Afro-Asian solidarity. China's interest in such international connections led to the production of images like this, Proletariat of the World Unite, made in 1968. I first became curious about this topic when I encountered a few woodcut prints produced by the artist Jiang in the early 1960s. I'm interested in what Jiang's prints tell us about what Chinese impressions of the fight against European colonialism in Africa, the civil rights movement in the United States, and also the interrelation of these two events. I would also like to explore how the messages conveyed by images of international racial diversity interacted with those depicting ethnic diversity within the PRC itself, such as this work, a poster of many different women who represent many different ethnic groups within China. And these people are in Beijing, and they're in Tiananmen Square, the part that's Tiananmen Gate, right behind them, that building. And that image was made in 1957. Now, this image is the one that was used to promote this lecture, and it was put online. It's called War Drum, and it actually is by Jiang. It's a black and white woodcut print that was produced in 1962. And I want to take some time to look at what exactly we see in this print. We see a Black man beating a very large drum. He and the people in the background wear the clothing and jewelry that at that time was typical in Chinese representations of Africans. And that's not to say that it is authentic dress. But also, there's one helmet that's lying on the ground among the feet of the people running, and it says MP on it. And it's meant to represent the military police of the United States Army. Now, the title of this talk says that it's about the African American experience in Chinese art, not the African experience. When I first saw this print, the combination of what looked to me like African fighters and American soldiers seemed odd. But I realized that my understanding of images like this is actually heavily influenced by my own background. And as you may have guessed from looking at my picture and hearing my voice, I'm a white woman raised in the United States, and I was actually born after the period when many of the former colonies in Africa gained independence, and also after the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So first of all, I had learned about all of these events as history. They're not part of my own personal experience. And then secondly, in that history that I was taught, that story of these events that I was taught, it's one that was taught to me in American schools, and the American experience was centered, was privileged. And so we were looking at the world from the point of view of the United States. So this image isn't looking at the world from the point of view of the United States, but it is, and kind of because of that, because of the ideas in China at the time, it's actually really closely related to Chinese images of the civil rights movement in the United States. And looking at these kinds of pictures together can help us better understand the dominant Chinese view at the time of Black revolutionaries throughout the world. It can also tell us more about China's perception of its own place within that world. Now, this is another woodcut by Jiang called Sharpen the Knife. It was made in 1964, so a little bit later. Now, it actually is showing, I believe, the civil rights movement in the United States. And so let's look carefully at what we can see in this image. Dominating the scene is a young Black man with a wide-brimmed hat, wearing a shirt and pants that look, to me, more or less appropriate for a young American in the 1960s. More striking is the very large knife that he's sharpening and the fierce look in his eyes. Now that might look quite threatening. It's meant to look threatening, but I also want us to think of it in the context of other images being produced in China at the time. Both of these images are a little bit later. They're posters from the late 60s, so from the Cultural Revolution. This style of representing the human form, and in particular men in these images, it was typical of revolutionary art at the time. So we've got young men, typically with very muscled forearms and big hands, and often very intense facial expressions, and very intense look in the eyes. And that intense look is meant to suggest kind of the intensity of their strength of purpose. Male revolutionaries were also described this way, not just visually, but with words in the literature of the period. So that style of figural representation only became more exaggerated in the Cultural Revolution, as we see here. And the Cultural Revolution lasted from 1966 to 1976. So it was just a little bit after the time when Jiang was making his prints. And the extremism of the Cultural Revolution was already growing in the early 60s. And that was already starting to be evident in some imagery from the time. And the prominent wielding of a weapon was also fairly common. It was a common attribute given particularly to male revolutionaries. So back to our print, Sharpen the Knife. I want us to look at it in the context of this other very revolutionary imagery that has, it's very emotional, very strident. It belongs actually to a larger category also of images made in China from the 1950s up through the 70s. that depict people of various races around the world rising up against Western powers, especially the United States. The images produced in China during this period, they largely focus on the US. Sometimes the UK is included. And significantly, after the Sino-Soviet split in 1961, we also start to see images that are critical of the Soviets' imperialistic aims. So in this print, on the left in the back, it's a little bit hard to see. It's up kind of in the corner behind his shoulder. There are some figures in white robes that are figures of the KKK. They're burning a cross, and there's a black man there who's been tied to a tree and set on fire. So yes, it is horrifying. It's not a lynching, but it is a reference to the deadly violence that's long been enacted on Black bodies in the United States. On the right, there's a crowd of people, looks like primarily African-American men, and they're fighting with a white man in a uniform, and that his helmet says US on it, and he represents the National Guard that had been called out to control the demonstration. To the right of the guardsman, it's much harder to see, but there's a darker outline of a person who looks like a policeman. The demonstrator who's in the front, closest to the National Guard, he's carrying a sign that says, "Stop Jim Crow." And it says it in English. And that's really interesting because Jiang Mei, as far as I know, didn't know English. And not many people in China at the time did. I don't think where Jiang Mei was living, there wasn't an international population. And I don't think Jiang ever traveled outside of China. So these kinds of things raise questions about what was he looking at that made him kind of depict this event this way. There's evidence in Chinese history of both positive and negative attitudes in China toward Black people, and this is going over centuries. And my hunch is that it was a mix of those positive and negative attitudes and images that influenced Jiang Mei's images. As for the English text, it might have been included strictly for historical fidelity, might have been partly based on a photograph he saw, but it raises a question of what audience this image was meant for. I found no evidence of this image circulating outside of China, or even circulating much in China. The only place I've seen it is in publications produced by Jiang Mei's family themselves. Also, the lead demonstrator holding the sign, he's got a bottle, he's got a dagger. I don't know if you can see. So it's something that likely would draw a stronger reaction from the National Guardsmen. But again, that dagger in his hand, as well as that very large knife that's in the foreground, they belong to the system of symbolism that was commonly seen in Chinese images of revolutionaries at the time. So I want to talk a little bit about Jiang Mei himself, and you'll hear me say his name sometimes Mi, the M-I. In fact, he's often called Jiang Mei, and the Mei is kind of an accent for how his name is pronounced in Sichuan. He was actually born in 1912. He passed away in 1989. He originally grew up in Zhejiang province, which is on China's east coast near the water. And he worked as an apprentice steelworker in Shanghai in the 1930s. And he also studied art in his spare time. He began making some money drawing advertisements and submitting illustrations to newspapers. He made several anti-Japanese cartoons, because in the 30s, this is when Japan is gradually encroaching on Chinese territory. And his artwork from this time, these cartoons, they were making very sharp social and political commentary. Now, when the war with Japan really began in earnest in 1937, Jiang Mei moved inland, like many other people. They ran inland to get away from the invasion. And he eventually settled in Chongqing, which I've marked on this map. That city became the wartime capital for the Chinese nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek. While no longer today, Chongqing is no longer officially part of Sichuan province, it is historically and culturally tied to Sichuan. And it was also the seat of power in southwestern China after the war. And what I'm referring to as southwestern China on this map might actually look to us like South China, but it's the southern part of China that is east of Tibet, and it borders Southeast Asia kind of on its southern section. It was the seat of power for that entire southwestern region immediately after the war. It was also a cultural center. So it was home to the leaders of the art bureaucracy for that region, and it was also home to the region's art academy. So Jiang Mei actually obtained work as a lecturer at that art academy, which was called the Southwest People's Art Academy, and he started working there in 1950. The revolution was in 1949, so that's when the PRC was founded in 1949. That school that Jiang Mei was working at later became the Sichuan Fine Arts Institute, which is the name it still bears today. And Jiang rose up in the ranks, and he became assistant chair of the drawing department in 1954. Now, when he gets to Sichuan, he shifts focus. He eventually starts making woodblock prints. The vast majority of the prints he produced throughout his life were black and white woodcuts that focused on peaceful rural scenes. Many of his earlier works were like the two shown here, pastoral views of people farming or herding animals. His woodcuts were celebrated for their clean, detailed line work and their comforting wholesomeness. A few of his works, like the one on the left here, include a view of Southwest China's dramatic landscape. Images celebrating the Chinese land and the human control and use of that land were common during this period. They were testaments to the productivity that was ostensibly enabled by the good governance of the Chinese Communist Party. Many printmakers in Chongqing produced similar rural images. Several of those Sichuan artists also focused on the many ethnic minority groups that live in China's southwest region. The prints depicting Tibetans are the best known, and this one is probably the best known of all. It's Tibetan Girl by Li Huanmin. It was produced about the time and widely circulated around the time of the communists moving in kind of full force into the central Tibetan area. Tibet is right next to Sichuan. I don't if you're familiar with the area, and actually the area that is really the western half almost of Sichuan province is actually traditionally kind of culturally a Tibetan area. Some of the printmakers also went to other places. They went to Guizhou, which is south of Sichuan, kind of southeast of Sichuan, and then Yunnan province is southwest and actually borders Vietnam. And so they were producing images of ethnic minorities living there. The main purpose of these prints was to show people who lived in other parts of China the variety of ethnic groups that were living in China at the time. In the 1950s, the PRC had begun a process that was based on a process that had earlier been used by the Soviet Union to officially identify the various ethnic groups within the country and to label them, to categorize them. This was part of a larger effort to fully control all the regions in the country and to, exert central governmental control over all the people living in China and to integrate them into a relatively unified Chinese society. Today, China officially recognizes 56 ethnicities of people living in its borders, or people who are citizens, and the largest group by far, about 92%, is Han Chinese. Now, these images that were being made of people out in the countryside, they served an important goal. They were brought back and often really finished up back in the city when the artists came back to their studios. And so it was showing these different parts of China to other people living elsewhere in the country. And that was important because the central government wanted to cement the concept that China was indeed a multi-ethnic nation. We see here in this slide various ways that these prints were circulated to the general population. So they were published in newspapers, in periodical pictorial magazines, and also in street-side art exhibitions. I've got here, because it's pretty, a print of an outside exhibition, but actually there are photographs of exhibitions like this happening too. So back to these two prints. These images of kind of the ethnic minorities within China, they suggest a number of different things about power relations between different groups of people in China. Some of the images promote a sense of equality, and others suggest that the Han Chinese were the more civilized and superior group. So for example, on the print that's on the right, the Dai minority who are in their home, there's a man playing music and two women with turbans on their heads. They're depicted a little bit differently and a little bit in more darkness than the Han Chinese woman. And what she's doing is recording their songs. So she's gone there to study them. But there's a significant difference in the way the figures are depicted. Oops. So images of actual foreigners were extremely rare, at least among Sichuan printmakers working before the 1980s. This is one example I have of a print by Li Xiaoyan. He actually had an opportunity to go to Albania. And what he's depicted here in this 1957 print is an Albanian woman drawing water. Now, Li Xiaoyan was a particularly powerful figure in Sichuan's art world in the post-war period. He was chairman of the Sichuan Artists Association, and so that's likely why he was the one who got this rare opportunity to go abroad during the 1950s. There's also a handful of images that depict Vietnam. And this is a print that's depicting an event happening in Vietnam while Vietnam was still at war with the United States, or really in the early years of that war. This print's by Song Guangxun, who was able to actually travel briefly to northern Vietnam during the war. And he reports that he actually saw an American plane shot down during that trip. Oops. So Jiang Mei's woodcuts from this time, however, he was actually kind of unusual. His prints did not focus on minorities. He did not show images of foreigners generally. He consistently depicted the simple comforts of really Han Chinese rural life. Except there were a few years in the early 1960s when he created several prints of revolutionaries in Africa and the United States. And then again in 1979 and 80, we made a few prints critical of the Soviet Union. But I want to focus primarily on the images of the Black activists or Black revolutionaries, the ones from the early 60s. Of his prints on this theme, War Drum here garnered the most acclaim. It was selected for inclusion in China's 5th National Printmaking Exhibition in 1962 and the 4th National Art Exhibition in 1963. Having artwork accepted to these national exhibitions was a major accomplishment for artists in China at this time, as inclusion in these centrally controlled exhibitions was a primary way that artists could increase their status in the arts bureaucracy and receive better jobs and living conditions. This print was also featured on a Chinese postal stamp that celebrated the first anniversary of Africa Freedom Day in 1964. That day commemorated the founding of the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And that founding had happened on May 25th, 1963. Now, images like War Drum were created in response to China's broader efforts to make political and economic connections with nations in what was considered the Third World during the Cold War. In the 1950s, China had been closely allied with the Soviet Union, but it sent representatives to the Bandung Conference, which was held in Bandung, Indonesia in April of 1955. This was a meeting of African and Asian leaders who were opposed to Western Soviet colonialism and neocolonialism. Some of these leaders were already concerned by the mid-1950s about the possibility of China actually having its own imperialist goals. Later, the Sino-Soviet split, which culminated in China's official denunciation of Soviet-style communism in 1961, led China to look for new partners as it sought to position itself as an alternative global power center, so primarily an alternative to the United States or the Soviet Union. The desire for China and its government to be seen in a positive light is clear in this other print by Jiang Mei, titles translated as Longing, from 1963. We see a young girl, apparently from Africa. She's hugging a doll that looks like it's a Chinese girl. And on the table in front of her sits a book that's open to a picture of Tiananmen in Beijing, and there's a rose sitting on top of it. This was an idealized view of the admiration of China that China wanted to ignite in the people of other developing countries. In the early 1960s, after the Sino-Soviet split, we start to see images like this painting, and it shows a variety of people from Asia, Africa, and Latin America looking at Mao Zedong for leadership. On August 8th, in 1963, Mao made a statement called Statement Supporting the American Negroes in Their Just Struggle Against Racial Discrimination by U.S. Imperialism, in which he said, I call on the workers, peasants, revolutionary intellectuals, enlightened elements of the bourgeoisie, and other enlightened persons of all colors in the world, whether white, black, yellow, or brown, to unite to oppose the racial discrimination practiced by U.S. imperialism and support the American Negroes in their struggle against racial discrimination. In the final analysis, national struggle is a matter of class struggle. So it's in that historical context that Jiang Mei produced Sharpen the Knife, War Drum, and this print, Combat, from 1963. Here we see men in traditional African dress on the attack, holding a spear, shield, bow and arrow, and a gun. One puts his foot on the helmet of a U.S. soldier. That same year, Jiang produced the print Spark. The title of this print is a reference to the title on the book that the man's reading, A Single Spark Can Start a Prairie Fire, by Mao Zedong. Again, we have the question of why Jiang Mei is depicting the title in English rather than Chinese. Mao wrote this text in 1930 to address other Chinese communist revolutionaries who were pessimistic at a time when the young movement had suffered several setbacks. The phrase means that small movements can eventually result in major changes, as is symbolized in this print by a few small sparks on the ground and then the large roaring fire that we see to the left of the man in the foreground. The clothing of the men in this image is Western in style, rather than the robes we saw in the depictions of Africans. So that suggests they're meant to represent African-American activists in the United States. They're armed with large guns and appear to be camped around a fire in the forest at night. The suggestion here is that Black people fighting for their civil rights in the United States would need to undertake the same armed revolution that had happened in other places that had fought against colonial powers, like China and Africa, for instance. Now, the sudden appearance of the U.S. civil rights movement as a subject matter in Jiang Mei's prints should not give the impression that China's interest in racial oppression in the United States began at that time. Paul Robeson, an American singer, actor, and activist, never traveled to China, but he expressed support for its anti-imperialist revolutionaries as early as the 1930s. He recorded the song Qilai, March of the Volunteers, in the 1940s, and intended to donate the proceeds to the Chinese Communist movement. That song was later made the PRC's national anthem, and Robeson was honored in the official Chinese press upon his death in 1981. W.B. Dubois, an American intellectual and civil rights activist who supported the Pan-African movement and internationalism generally. He had first been to China in 1936, and then he was invited back by Mao Zedong in 1959. Other Black intellectuals followed in the 60s and 70s. In spite of those high-level connections, Chinese artists' depictions of the civil rights movement in the US are actually quite rare, and the production of these images seems to have been spurred actually by independence movements in Africa. The Black American experience was seemingly tied to the idea of African liberation in the minds of the Chinese. Jiang Mei's images of Black revolutionaries were unusual compared not just to his own body of work, but they also stood out from the work produced by other printmakers in Chongqing at the time. This group of artists rarely produced images of violence or even the preparation for fighting. As a rule, such works focused on the past, such as the war with Japan or the Chinese Civil War. And we see that in the color print on the upper left here, which is a depiction of a key fight that happened in Sichuan between the communists and the nationalists back during the Long March, so before the PRC was founded. And then sometimes violence is shown happening outside of China. So the print on the lower right is that same image of Vietnamese. So this is something that's happening in a war with America that's happening outside of Chinese borders. As far as I know, the other printmakers in Sichuan, who were quite active and quite well known, were not making any images of Black people. But there is some evidence of other work on this subject being produced in Sichuan, specifically at the Sichuan Fine Arts Institute, where Jiang Mei was a faculty member. In June of 1964, the journal Meishu, which was the top art journal in China at the time, included an article and a series of photo plates featuring the work of several sculptors from Sichuan. Long Xuli's sculpture, African Mother, was featured on the cover. Long Xuli was then a student in the sculpture department of the Sichuan Fine Arts Institute, and his sculpture depicts an African woman kneeling down, seeming to rest, and she has a rifle cradled in one arm and a child on her back. As the 60s wore on, Chinese artists continued making images of African revolutionaries, but it doesn't appear that Jiang Mei made any more after 1964. These are two examples of mass-produced posters that show African men fighting alongside people of other nationalities. In the upper left poster, we see a Black man, a Chinese man, and a man perhaps from Latin America. The small figure to the left, who's like down there in the little red waves, is actually an American military officer who's holding up a small missile. The main trio of characters on the right, they mirror the standard arrangement of kind of revolutionary images of domestic images of people in China, where often the arrangement was worker, peasant, and soldier. In these international groupings, the Chinese man is often in the center and placed a little higher, leading the other two. Once the Cultural Revolution started in 1966, Jiang Mei and other artists and teachers of his stature were politically and physically attacked. There were several years when Jiang didn't produce any art at all, or not any that was circulated or preserved. However, Black people continued to appear in Chinese images, promoting international solidarity. This poster from that period shows the stark use of Black and red colors that were common in images from the time, and it also shows an international grouping of people, a white man, a Chinese man, and a Black man, and it suggests Chinese dominance by placing the Chinese man in the center, and he's very slightly elevated, which you can see if you look at the level of their eyes. All three figures are holding copies of Mao's quotations, and two of them could be seen wearing red armbands that are similar to those that were worn by Red Guards during the Cultural Revolution. So here we have another image from the Cultural Revolution, the very beginning of it in 1966. And it shows an African woman, again, with a gun and a child. It's very similar. She's presented in a very similar way to Long Xuli's sculpture. And I do think it's significant that carrying a child had become part of the standard iconography of depicting African women in China. And that's something I haven't entirely unpacked yet. Now, once the Cultural Revolution ended, China began to vigorously pursue economic development in the 1980s. At that point, the militancy faded from the pictures of international groups of people. The focus switched to peace and friendship. There's a change of clothing, but also a very significant change in emotion. But there's a familiar presentation of international hierarchies. We can see it again in the one on the left, where the Chinese man is central. The top of his head's a little bit higher. And then also in the image of the women on the right, we again see it's the Black woman who's holding a baby. Now, after the Cultural Revolution, Jiang Mei was still alive and he got back to work producing prints. And he largely reverted or kind of went back to producing these images of rural scenes. He didn't revisit creating images of Africans or African Americans. He did make a handful of political prints, and these were critical of the Soviet Union. And they cast the USSR as an imperialist aggressor in other parts of Asia. So on the left, this is a militia soldier in Afghanistan. And I think the print was made right around 1980. The Soviet-Afghan War had begun in 1979. And in that war, China had actually supported the Mujahideen fighters, just as the United States had, in their guerrilla war against Afghanistan's Soviet-backed government and against the Soviet military itself. On the right, we have a more cartoonish image that actually seems to, be influenced by that cartoon style that Jiang had developed as a young man in Shanghai. It's related to war in Vietnam. It's not titled, but there says Vietnam on the man's hat. There's a reference to the Soviet Union in the band that's on the gun. And down in the water, or in the black liquid at the bottom, it's a reference to Cambodia. Vietnam, this is after the United States had pulled out of Vietnam. And Vietnam and Cambodia had gotten into a war starting in 1978, when Vietnam challenged and eventually pushed out of power the Chinese-backed Khmer Rouge government in Cambodia. This led to a brief border war between China and Vietnam in 1979. And during that conflict, the Soviet Union had actually provided aid, a non-combat aid to Vietnam during that conflict. And so China felt threatened by these Soviet incursions in the area around their western and southern borders. But aside from images like this, and there's just a handful, the vast majority of the prints that Jiang Mei produced really in the last decade of his life were really things like these two, these close studies of nature. He even moves away from the broad, expansive rural scenes, and they're usually these close studies of animals. So we've got a little red panda on the left and a black wagtail bird on the right here. So Jiang Mei appears to have only produced images of Black revolutionaries from 1962 to 1964. And that subject matter was never common among other artists in Chongqing generally. Images focusing specifically on the civil rights movement in the United States in the 60s were rare throughout China, making Jiang's few prints all the more special. They represent a particular Chinese view of that movement. While they shed some light on the Chinese population's perception of those events at the time, they also raise questions about the intended audience for the prints and whether or not they were circulated very broadly. These prints by Jiang Mei are also a part of a longer history of China's use of the struggles of ethnic minorities in other parts of the world. In propaganda, China's using these that as material in propaganda campaigns to promote the Chinese state. In 2020, this tweet by Hua Chunying, who was a spokesperson for the Chinese government, this got a lot of attention on the internet by readers in the United States. So State Department, a U.S. State Department spokesperson had tweeted the comment, this is a pivotal moment for the world. And this spokesperson is talking about the Chinese crackdown on protesters in Hong Kong, which had been going on since 2019, but there had been a recent event in May of 2020. And to continue, the American spokesperson says, freedom-loving people around the world must stand with the rule of law and hold to account the Chinese Communist Party, which has flagrantly broken its promises to the people of Hong Kong. And then Hua Chunying, representing the Chinese state, puts up in quotes, "I can't breathe." And as you probably know, those were George Floyd's last words. He had recently died that same month, setting off the Black Lives Matters movement in the United States. And that movement China was supportive of generally online. But we should see now that a tweet like this did not just come out of nowhere in May of 2020. It's part of a longer history of the government of the PRC framing racial tensions in the United States as a criticism of the US government, and then contrasting that tension with an image of Chinese social harmony. A tweet like this is best understood in the context of this longer history of exchange and in the context of China's own broad geopolitical goals. Okay, so thank you. And you can take my slides down now.
Thank you, Sonia, for that fascinating presentation. And so we're going to open it up for audience Q&A. And I have one question that, prompted by the image of the tweet exchange that you showed us. Who do you think the intended audience was for the tweet, "I can't breathe"? Meaning, you had mentioned how, this kind of tweet did not come out of nowhere. It has a historical framework, but how many people or which groups do you think would have understood that history to really get that tweet?
Yeah, that's a good question. The history, I don't think was understood in the United States. I think the audience really is an international audience who's seeing these tweets, and that's who the spokesperson is kind of poking at. Judging from the reaction, I don't think people took it as, I don't think many Americans even know about these prints, and there's not wide knowledge of W.E.B. Dubois going to China. There's not broad knowledge of Paul Robeson's support or kind of other activists from the United States going to China. I don't think in the United States there's even a very broad knowledge of the Pan-African movement or socialist internationalism or kind of socialism in general, what it's really about. And in my case, going through American school system, that wasn't the part of the world that was focused on. Mm-hmm. And those types of international relationships were not really focused on. In recent years, particularly because of partly in response to the Black Lives Matters movement, there's been a lot more scholarship coming out about connections between kind of African-American activists and China in particular. Mm-hmm. And there were some scholars who had been working on that for a while and had produced dissertations and are publishing articles, but all of that got more attention, at least in the scholarly world. But I don't know if it has penetrated kind of general American knowledge. I also don't know, I really have no idea how much younger people in China might know about this particular history.
Yeah, I would be curious to know what the curriculum is in China in terms of like world history, Chinese history. It's fascinating. So you had mentioned that the prints of that were showing images of ethnic minorities in China. Were you saying that these artists actually went to observe those groups in person, and then they returned to the city to finish off the images?
Yeah, that was generally the process for images of groups in China, and then also that one image of the Albanian woman. That would not have been the case with Jiang Mei's images of things set in Africa or the United States. But yeah, they would go, it was part of a broader kind of political social movement where it was believed that like artists in China in that period were considered intellectuals and somewhat deficient for being intellectuals, kind of in a revolutionary sense. And, Mao had said over and over, Mao had said actually in a very significant talk in 1942, that they needed to learn from the people. So you needed to go down to the countryside, kind of learn about quote unquote real life, kind of. And so that's what these artists were doing. They were sent really for work, but it wasn't even like they would go just to visit and hang out for a few days and do some interviews. Like they would go there and live for months and then, kind of live the life, of these spaces. But then also they would do many, many drafts and drawings and kind of collect materials that then they would bring back with them and then actually produce the finished prints in their studio back in Chongqing.
So then what would have been the types of images that would have been available for Jiang Mi that included Black bodies?
That's a question I still have because when I first saw his prints, I was actually working on something else, kind of a broader issue of kind of what these Sichuan printmakers were doing as a group and kind of looking more at how they were depicting minorities in China and also how they're depicting the landscape. And I wasn't sure what to do with these prints by Jiang Mi that kind of stuck out. And that's something that I need to do, is to look more into what images were circulating. I've looked high and low at prints, and I think the images circulating must be photographs. The print, like in the fine art world, the images are very few. You're more likely to see images that are kind of focusing on these kind of global groupings of different kind of people from different countries.
Yeah. Although I have to say, the image of the red panda is super cute.
Yeah, no, his images, those are some of his, I think, most well-known, most popular images are the one from late in his life. He's done a ton of little prints, or these close studies of animals, and they're adorable. And I can see why, like, those are the images that people want, they want, and they, want to look at images of and collect.
Yeah, it's kind of like, how in the beginning of his career, he had these more comforting images of rural China. And then you had this brief period of, images of Black revolutionaries. And then it's sort of like he's returning to a comforting subject matter in animal prints, perhaps.
Yeah, and during that period, like during the Cultural Revolution from probably 66 to about 72, like all of those artists were, that had any status, like they were teachers, so they were attacked in the Cultural Revolution. Many, at best, they ended up on house arrest and were not producing any art for several years, partly out of fear. Like they didn't want to make the wrong thing and they didn't know what would be right and what would be wrong. So they just didn't make anything until things started to kind of cool off a little bit in 1972. But it was, I mean, I think you can imagine what a traumatic event that would be, to live through that period. And then in the 80s, there's, Mao dies in 1976. And then there start to be really rapid, massive economic shifts and cultural and social shifts. And these artists who have made their whole career, like most of their adult lives, have been spent in the socialist organization of society, where the art world had a very specific order to it. There were only certain ways you could be, certain avenues you had to present your work to get an audience. There wasn't a gallery system. There wasn't the same type of system that is common today of selling your works in galleries, and museum shows were controlled by the government bureaucracy, and so they've got to adjust completely to a new way of living.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can see he's quite a bit older in the 80s, but also they've been through this trauma and the world has not gone back to what it was. It's become something that's completely different than what you grew up with. So, I could see, wanting to make, sweet, calm, comfortable images at that point.
Yeah. And so we have a question from our very own Ani Proser over at Facebook, and she asks, do you think Jiang Mi would have recognized the irony of making uplifting images of American minorities, while images of Chinese minorities presented them as lesser than the Han majority?
I don't think so. I think it was that sense of Han superiority was so prevalent. I don't think anyone saw it, and I don't think he would have seen what was going on with the civil rights movement in the United States as being at all relevant to the situation in China. Because supposedly the Han Chinese and their government was benevolent, and it in certain ways, like China's really different from the United States, but in certain ways it's the same, and these same types of pleasant stories that people tell themselves about the society they've created, that others might look at from the outside and be like, no, that's maybe not true. Like those same types of stories get told, and people see shortcomings somewhere else, but think that what they're doing is right. And now I don't know if Jiang Mi had lived until today, if his attitudes would have changed, but I don't get the sense for any of these artists that they're seeing kind of any irony, not in anything. Even for some of the younger artists I was able to interview them, they were still alive. Like never anything like that.
Mm-hmm. And so did Jiang Mi leave behind any writings? Because I know you had, if you wouldn't mind sort of briefly telling us about the type of research you did for this topic.
Well, Jiang Mi, of the artists I was looking at, he was one of the older ones, and he passed away earlier in the 80s, which was definitely before I was doing any research. He did do some writing. He was a professor. He wrote some about what he was thinking. I haven't found anything of him saying anything about this in particular. I did get to talk to his daughter, who's also a printmaker and a well-known artist, and she's actually the one who made the print of the Battle on the Bridge, that color print.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was able to talk to her a little about her dad and, about her own work. She's the one who's kind of done the work of kind of saving his work and presenting it. And so is kind of the holder of the materials. But I would love to find what he was saying at the time about these images. And what I'm thinking is that, because there was this sculpture student making, this image of the female African revolutionary with her child, there was a student at the school that Jiang Mei was at who made this sculpture. I'm hoping that there is some type of essay written somewhere, not in the National Journal of Art, maybe in a more local publication, or someone remembering, a particular movement that happened at the school then. It can be really hard to get that kind of information if there's a handful of artists, a small number of these artists who are working at this time, who were actually like taking it upon themselves to write about their own work and write what was going on. At the time, they typically say things that are very politically correct. And they maybe, say things that are a little more expansive later in their life in interviews, but that wasn't an opportunity I had with Jiang Mei.
Yeah. Well, we definitely wish you all the best in your continuing research on this topic.
Yeah, I need to get back to China and go visit Jiang Dubois, his daughter. She's got all this stuff.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, that's all the time that we have for today. So thank you so much, Sonia. That was fantastic.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been pleasant, and thank you if anyone is listening. This is a very strange environment to give a presentation in, but thank you for inviting me. It's been a good experience.
You're very welcome. So I definitely want to give a big thank you to our digital team for producing this program. And finally, a bigger thank you to all of you, the audience, for sharing this experience with us. We certainly welcome you back for more programs on our social platforms. And for upcoming program, please visit our website at thewalters.org. Thanks so much. Have a great evening.